Chapter 5, Baptism. When you are 6 or 7 years old and are made to go to church regularly, it can seem as if you are there for most of your life. Every Sunday morning, Marmee would dress us in our Sunday best, starched cotton dresses with puffed sleeves, white socks worn with freshly whitened sensible shoes, and hair pulled back in tightly plaited bunches, decorated with brightly coloured ribbons, which all went together to give us that Sunday best feeling. Perhaps that's why I still love dressing up today. When she finally got all 6 bickering and excited children ready, which was quite a feat, we would go to early morning service at the local Pentecostal church. The preacher there was a huge tall man. He looked as tall as the church, especially when he stood on the pulpit. I thought he was a giant. His skin had a rich, dark ebony sheen. It was truly black. His expressive eyes shone like a torch. He spoke to us, and you wouldn't dream of not paying attention, even though sometimes it was hot and uncomfortable. The women always brought fans with them, which they would wave continuously as they shouted "Hallelujah" every now and then. At a certain point during the service, the children would go to a room off the main part of the church. There we would have our own special service and be told Bible stories that taught us how to care for each other. We had to recite the 10 Commandments and say prayers for our families and friends. I always had a good feeling inside when I said my prayers. It was a contented feeling of happiness and of understanding the difference between right and wrong. You would have thought that all this was enough church going for one day, but no. After lunch, Marmee would take us to the Salvation Army Sunday school. I loved going there because apart from all the singing and praying, we were taught to play musical instruments. Even though I was not much of a musician, I was a hit on the triangle and cymbals, just one note at a time, though. All of us together must have sounded dreadful, but it was great fun, and it was a good way of letting off steam. The weekly ritual still didn't end here. At 6 o'clock we would finish off at the local Anglican church for evening service. Although I was christened in the Anglican church, my parents took us to most of the other churches, so they thought it was important that we understood and appreciated how others worshipped. They felt it would give us a broader outlook on life, but the places of worship, even though I never got the opportunity to venture inside, were the Hindu temples, of which Dad. I always wondered what went on inside those beautiful buildings, especially when they were all lit up with twinkling candles during Diwali, the Festival of Lights. Out of all the services I did attend, I remember the ones from the Pentecostal church most of all, because those were the most uplifting. The rejoicing from the congregation almost raised the roof. I used to watch open mouth, fascinated by the women who trembled and shook their bodies in the aisles as they felt the Spirit. One Sunday, instead of going to church, we all went to a river to see a baptism ceremony. Everyone was dressed in white, the women and girls in long flowing dresses with white scarves wrapped as turbans on their heads, the men and boys in white shirts and trousers. The tall preacher man looked more gigantic than ever as he stood at the water's edge. He spread out his arms, looked up to the sky, and prayed for the souls of people to be blessed. Then he called forward all those who wanted to be baptized, and one by one, after a prayer with each, he ducked them under the water 3 times. They came out drenched but rejoicing, all except the children, who seemed a little overwhelmed by the whole experience. The spirit of the baptism was intoxicating. The smell of the ointment used tantalized my nostrils. The mood of the men, women, and children, all barefooted and chanting, is embossed on my memory. Now that you've read Baptism, Chapter 5, have a look at the statements on this slide about what happens and see if you can match them. You can do this on a rough piece of paper or in your English book, I don't mind. You do not need to have to print out this sheet. Now I would like you to read Chapter 6, and there will be some questions to be answered there as well. There was always talk of someone who'd left the island who had gone to England to be met with open arms. Fantastic stories of how life was wonderful and how much money could be made. of how the islanders were wanted and needed to help Britain build herself up again in the years after the war, and how people could better themselves overnight. The streets were said to be paved with gold. Life was far from unbearable in Trinidad, but many people were tempted by these stories and couldn't resist the opportunity. Not only unskilled workers, but artists, writers, musicians, students, as well as assorted intellectuals made the decision to leave their tropical island home. As children, we didn't take much notice of all this talk. It was almost like stories Dardy had made up for us. But all of a sudden, the stories got very close to home. While in bed one night, Sandra and I overheard Dardy telling Marmee that he wanted to go and make a new life in England. He was frustrated by not being able to play jazz, the music he'd heard so much about, but got such little opportunity to play because the music in Trinidad was calypso, Latin, and steel pan. A friend who'd settled in England had written and told him he could not only get a chance to play jazz, but also make lots of money. The discussion went on into the night and over the following weeks. Newspapers, advertising jobs, and boat journeys to Britain were left around the house. Some nights in bed I could hear Marmee crying, saying she would never leave us. I felt so reassured by those words. They were my only comfort during those restless nights. I started to have dreams, bad dreams, nightmares of being left alone, falling with no one to catch me. I told not a soul about my dreams and anxieties. If I did, then perhaps they would come true, and I didn't want them to. So I kept silent, pretended I didn't know what was going on. But the talk of going to England never stopped. Then finally, it was decided that all 8 of us go at once. So Dardy would go first and send us for later. I was so relieved that Marmee wasn't going to leave us too. I was sad to see Dardy go, so I cried a little when he left, but was soon back to my old self. Life hadn't changed much as Marmee was still with us. Things were almost back to normal, no more constant talk of going to England. But then the unthinkable happened. Marmee started asking family and friends if they would look after us, because she was going to join Dardy in England without us. I was devastated. She was going to break her vow. She had said she would never leave us. I wished night after night that it wouldn't happen. I thought my wish had come true when none of my family would take us. They all had too many children. Grandparents usually took care of the children when parents left for a new world, but that was not to be the case with us. We had none. Marmee began to sell the furniture and all her jewellery as well as the silver we got for our christenings. She started singing in her own special way, the same song she sang before Dardy left. Now she was singing it again and again. This is the hour when we say goodbye. Soon you'll be sailing far across the sea. When you're away, please remember me. She would start to cry and hug us while she sang. Then we would all start to cry. I couldn't understand why she wanted to leave us. If she loved us, why couldn't we all stay together, especially as no one wanted to take care of us? But she kept telling us that she did love us, and that is why she was going to England to try to make a better life for us. We couldn't all go together because she and Dardy didn't have enough money, but one day they would. Unexpectedly, 2 of our godparents said they would take us. We couldn't stay together, though. Lester and Ellington would stay south in San Fernando. Sandra and I would go north to Tunapuna. The lucky 2 were Cynthia and Junior, the 2 youngest, who would go with Marmee to England. This was the day when a veil of unhappiness came down on my life. To be separated from Dardy was bad enough. He had now been gone for a year. Separated from my beloved Marmee and my younger brothers and sister were like the end of the world to me. My happy little world was beginning to crack and break into pieces, drifting away from me like flower petals scattered on a pond. We were all so very close. We all played together and had no other friends. Life was going to be sad and lonely, and that soon proved to be true. The people who looked after Sandra and me, we called them auntie and uncle, as a sign of respect even though we weren't related, treated us like servants. Lester and Ellington were treated even worse by the people who looked after them. They had to fight each other for food, winner take all. They worked hard in the day and at night were forced to sleep not in a bed but under it. We were told every day that we were lucky to have someone to give us a home and that we should be grateful to them because we could have ended up in an orphanage. Later, Marmee told us that twice a month she'd sent us money, clothes and parcels, but we never saw any of them. Instead, we had to work from 5 o'clock in the morning, cleaning the house, preparing meals, and washing all before we left for school. I was so tired I didn't learn much at our new school, but I remember Sandra and me being bullied because we were newcomers. I was a good fighter and fought Sandra's battles for her too. One of the most embarrassing moments I had there was when the elastic in my homemade knickers snapped as I ran to school to avoid being late. The knickers landed at my feet and all the children started laughing at me, especially one particular boy. I was so angry and humiliated that I lashed out at him. He was bigger than me, but I didn't care. I must have looked and acted crazy because from then on, no one ever laughed, teased or bullied Sandra and me again. After school it was no fun, except when we walked home during the mango season. The mango trees would be laden with ripe, juicy fruit. It looked so tempting and irresistible that Sandra and I would risk all to get some of the sweet, mouth-watering fruit. We would climb over the fence and pick as many mangoes from the drooping branches as we dared before the owner chased us off. If the mangoes weren't ripe, we would both get tummy ache from eating them. One day, on our way home, we saw the preparations for a funeral. A local man had died and neighbours were encouraged to go in and pay their last respects. Sandra and I persuaded each other to go in and pay ours. I didn't know what to expect or quite understand why I was going in. The truth was that I didn't want to go home, and anything to delay us for just a blissful moment was welcome. So we shuffled into the hushed room where the open mahogany casket was laid on the table. I slowly edged forward until it was my turn to say goodbye. I looked down at the old man's face and was so surprised at what I saw. It was the most peaceful, serene face I had ever seen. He didn't look old and wrinkled, but contented, almost smiling. I smiled back at him as I whispered goodbye under my breath. I wasn't scared, but happy that I had discovered something that, up until then, had been the unknown. The atmosphere at the funeral was quite different. This was when the mourners let their feelings out. They cried and wailed. Some even threw themselves across the casket. That evening, they had a wake to celebrate his life and give him a good send-off. It was like a party. There was nothing for me to celebrate when I got home, only work. Ironing clothes, picking the husks off the rice, sweeping the big dusty yard and collecting the eggs. I remember once having to catch a chicken, wring its neck, pluck the feathers and prepare it for dinner. I hated doing it and cried myself to sleep that night. In fact, most nights Sandra and I cried ourselves to sleep. We wrote to Marmee in England, but our letters were always vetted and lines crossed out if Auntie and Uncle didn't approve of what we wrote. After a few months, we moved to a new house with an inside bath and toilet. Auntie bought all the latest gadgets, a fridge, an electric iron. You name it, she bought it. She was a very superstitious woman, and each day at the new house, Sandra and I had to go through the bizarre ritual of waking up at 4 in the morning, sprinkling holy water around the house, especially across the doorway, to ward off evil spirits. I couldn't understand why we had to do this, as we were being treated in an evil way inside the house. To me, the evil had already entered. It felt as if our sentence of unhappiness was going to last forever. I prayed and wished for the day when I would be with Marmee, Daddy, and all my brothers and sisters again. For the happy, carefree days of family life, which gave me such a feeling of security and confidence. I had lost that feeling and longed to get it back. Now that you've read chapter 6, where Floella first gets acquainted with the idea of coming to England, pages 35 to 41, now have a look at these statements and see which ones match. If you want to print it, you can. It's not necessary. Just have a look at them and in your English book, write which you think are the correct statements. And when we meet up at the end of the day, I'll go through the answers. Hope you've enjoyed reading chapter 5 and chapter 6 today. We will be discussing more about chapter 6 and Floella's experience in Thursday's lesson.